I think we're going to try to get this session started. I'm Eric Davidson. I'm president of the American Geophysical Union, and I want to thank you all for being here. We convene this session because nationalism the world over is on the rise. We see it taking form in every continent with potentially serious consequences for the scientific process. In particular, we see that it's more than a socio-political designation. Nationalist policies obstruct the free exchange of ideas and effective collaboration among scientists. In countries with nationalist governments, several academics have lost their jobs or their ability to carry out their missions. Academic freedoms have been restricted, and science and education defunded. Here in the U.S., the enrollment of foreign students in U.S. universities has declined, perhaps in part due to worries students have about obtaining visas and fears over reported xenophobic sentiments and policies that some of our leaders appear to condone. Restricting visas in the name of national security also limits the ability of scientists to work collaboratively, including several who were forced to withdraw papers from this 2018 fall meeting because they were unable to obtain visas. We lose, science loses, and society loses by not being able to hear and learn from them. While we recognize differences of opinion regarding immigration, national security, and other policies, we cannot remain silent when human dignity is violated and when the free exchange of ideas and knowledge is impeded. With about 40% of AGU members from outside the U.S., this question clearly extends beyond American politics. Science always benefits from diversity, and this is not a time to remain silent while nativist leaders and their regimes deter us from fostering diverse contributions from our international membership. So what are the appropriate responses for scientific societies like AGU and its international membership? Consistent with the 2018 AGU meeting theme, What Science Stands For, this panel is asked to consider appropriate responses of the international scientific community to recent trends towards nationalism around the globe and its implications for the scientific enterprise. I'm going to ask each of our four panelists to speak for approximately 10 minutes, providing their unique perspective on this topic. We'll then follow with a panel discussion at the end and then with a Q&A session with the audience. Our first speaker is Jessica Wyndham. Jessica is the director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law program at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She also serves as a coordinator of the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition, a network of scientific, engineering, and health associations that recognize the role of science and technology in human rights. Her area of expertise include intersections of science, technology, human rights, ethics, the social responsibilities of scientists and engineers, and the role of professional scientific, engineering, and health societies in the promotion and protection of human rights. A human rights lawyer by training, she has managed projects throughout Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and the Americas, including as legal advisor for the Internal Displacement Project of the Brookings Institution, for the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in Ecuador, and as consultant to the Asia Pacific Forum in Australia. Jessica.
Thank you very much to Eric for this invitation and to the AGU. I just finished reading the book Lab Girl by Hope Yaren, and she dedicates an entire chapter to the trials and tribulations of getting to an AGU annual meeting. And so it helped me recognize the importance of being here in my easy commute from the office. So AAAS has been concerned with the promotion and the protection of the scientific enterprise since its founding 170 years ago, But it was in the 1970s that AAAS started to become involved in the defense of the rights of scientists, particularly internationally, focusing then on scientists threatened, harassed, detained, and sometimes worse in the former Soviet Union. For some time, we focused on individual cases. We had staff dedicated to conducting research. We conducted studies on threats to the right to travel. More and more, particularly in the last decade, we've tried more to coordinate and help facilitate action across professional societies, recognizing that there can be greater effect when there are multiple voices involved. We have decentralized the work within AAAS, engaging the Executive Office, the Office of Government Relations, our International Office, and my own program. And we've recognized that there's a value in multiple approaches to these issues. The National Academies, for example, has a committee on human rights, the work of which is primarily behind doors. You will not know what cases they're working on. There's Scholars at Risk, which provides work opportunities in the United States and at universities elsewhere overseas for displaced scholars. There's the work of professional societies such as my own, yours, the American Chemical Society, the Physical Society, the anthropologists, the sociologists, that have committees dedicated to protecting the rights of members of their discipline. The Committee of Concerned Scientists, which conducts significant advocacy on these issues, and then other groups such as Physicians for Human Rights that similarly focus on the rights of members of one particular discipline. We were asked to be somewhat conversational and provide stories, whether personal or from our professional experience. So I want to give you some examples of the ways in which AAAS has responded to the types of challenges that Eric mentioned, and highlight both the varied ways that you can act, but also the challenges in doing so. So on September 24, 2017, the US government announced an extension and expansion of the temporary travel restrictions previously imposed by an executive order in March of the same year. The restrictions applied to certain groups of travelers coming from a list of several countries, including many countries from which I have members of my family. In the case of Iran, for example, the restriction applied to all immigrants and non-immigrants except for students on certain categories of visa. Since then, further restrictions have been applied, including in May of this year, when Chinese researchers specifically were the subject of a travel ban. In each instance, as this policy has evolved, AAAS has issued a public statement and in several cases done so in concert with a long list of other professional societies. In our first statement in March of 2017, we said, "Scientific progress depends on openness, transparency, and the free flow of ideas. These principles have helped the United States attract and benefit from international scientific talent. Impacts to US leadership in science, technology, and innovation should be considered in development of immigration and visa policy. Where relationships have existed with officials in relevant government agencies, we've expressed our concerns to them directly." But what has been the impact of these interventions? I can't say, except that it's unclear whether indeed there has been an impact, and that's one of the greatest challenges of work in this area. Turning to Turkish academics. On the international stage, the opportunities for impact may exist, but the means of achieving impact are often even less clear, and the need for due diligence in understanding the national context even greater, as the risks of causing additional harm may be significant. In the case of thousands of Turkish academics who were fired and arrested under a string of emergency decrees issued in July of 2016, more than 150,000 public officials were let go without due process, including more than 5,500 academics. According to government statements, the main target is employees suspected of ties with the Gulen movement, a religious movement the Turkish government describes as a terrorist organization. In this instance, professional scientific societies, aware of what's been taking place, have been hamstrung in what they could do by the fear that academics in Turkey have expressed and the reality that sharing any information electronically about their circumstances might put them in further danger. So what could be done? In AAAS's case, Science magazine has published multiple articles raising awareness about the initial targeting of academics and maintaining a focus on their plight as time passes with little improvement in their situation. Currently, we're learning through news that's trickling out with details of what's happening in the northwest province of Xinjiang in China, where major purges are reported to be occurring in the region's universities, with a pattern said to be emerging of Uyghur academics being targeted, particularly those with foreign links and who specialize in Uyghur Muslim culture, language, or religion. These reports are consistent with findings of the United Nations that large numbers of ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are being held incommunicado and often for long periods, without being charged or tried and under the pretext of countering terrorism and religious extremism. There are reports of mass surveillance disproportionately affecting the Uyghur minority and of people in the region being required to hand in their travel documents and seek permission to leave the country. Other ways in the last several years in which scientists have been harassed or silenced. In Argentina, statisticians compiling and publishing inflation figures that were sharply at odds with government statistics led to fines, followed by a criminal complaint and firings. In Bahrain, doctors who treated protesters during the demonstrations for reform in 2011 were jailed and tortured. So what's to be done? What leverage do we have? And why should we, as scientists and scientific societies in the US, do anything? So there are several answers to the question of what to do. The best answers are dependent on the circumstances of any given case, the opportunities for influence and impact, the connections to be drawn upon, and an assessment of the risks. For issues arising in the US, the options include public statements of a single organization, or as AAAS has facilitated through its 260+ affiliated organizations, large sign-on letters directed to the executive and/or the legislative branches. Hearings and Hill briefings offer an opportunity to engage in dialogue with lawmakers, and as we've seen used more recently, public demonstrations of disaffection like the March for Science galvanize the public in the service of science and create new alliances and public awareness of the challenges being faced by the scientific community to the detriment of us all. And for issues arising internationally, the options are highly dependent on the circumstances as well. As Eric mentioned, AAAS serves as the Secretariat for a Science and Human Rights Coalition, a network of scientific and engineering societies that recognize the role for science and scientists in human rights. Among the coalition's members are most, if not all, of those that for decades have been at the forefront of the defense of the rights of scientists when imperiled around the world. And through the coalition, we've developed a primer on what to do in the case of threatened scientists. Options given include meeting with government officials at home or abroad, for example, the relevant State Department desk officer or embassy official, engaging partner scientific societies in country for information gathering and advocacy, letter writing, petition development. Other options include reaching out to the relevant regional or human rights body to register a concern or even to launch a legal action. The question for which the answer is possibly more obvious to this audience is why. As the abstract for this session states, we cannot remain silent when human dignity is violated and when the free exchange of ideas and knowledge is impeded. It's worth noting that there are universally agreed principles of human rights that provide a common language and conceptual framework for addressing these issues. The rights to freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and to freedom of movement are core to a thriving scientific enterprise. Furthermore, one international treaty to which 169 countries are a party, the United States is not one, recognizes expressly the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress, and also the right to freedom indispensable for scientific research. While in the US, appeal to human rights can sometimes be ineffective at best and detrimental at worst, it should not be assumed that the same is the case in most other countries, where using the language of human rights at least can be used as a mobilizing tool for civil society, and in some instances may have effect on the government. Finally, when considering the question of why, I want to leave you with the words of one scientist, a physicist who was studying in Texas when he returned to Iran for a visit, was invited or told to remain in Iran to contribute to research for military projects, which he refused to do and was subsequently arrested, imprisoned, and tortured. He has since been released, but is in very poor health. Omid Kochaba received the attention and support of several scientific organizations. We don't know, but it is possible that that attention contributed to his release. He was awarded the AAAS Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award, and because he was imprisoned, was unable to attend the ceremony in which that was given. But he did write a letter to read at the ceremony. He says, and excuse me for being a little over time, but I would like to read just an excerpt of his letter. The second thing I'd like to point out is something I've learned in these past 4 years while living among political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. And that is the need to support scientists, engineers, and technicians who, based on moral and humanitarian principles, expose violations by governments and institutions. They expose them to inform the public of state and institutional wrongdoings in order to initiate appropriate reactions that would stop or correct them. These whistleblowers often face the wrath of the wrongdoers, and thus they often pay a heavy price for their disclosures. Therefore, they need our support. I suggest that scientific and human rights groups strengthen, his letter continues, strengthen and expand their activities in this area while at the same time establish a joint international organization that would create the largest network of scientists from around the world. Foremost, such a network would be in charge of training courageous, responsible, and humanitarian scientists armed with moral principles that would make them aware of the dangers of misusing scientific and technological advances. Secondly, this organization would rise to the defense of scientists who face the danger of standing up for their principles. This is not just a matter for imprisoned scientists, but it also includes all other scientists, engineers, and technical experts who become vulnerable when they refuse to participate in destructive or inhumane projects, or when they expose scientific or technological wrongdoing. Omid's letter reflects the specificities of his case, but the principles he espouses have broader application to all scientists, who as members of educated elites, as influencers in society because of the knowledge they generate and share, can become targets. As AAAS said in a statement adopted last year, scientific freedom and scientific responsibility are essential to the advancement of human knowledge for the benefit of all. And as such, I would argue that what science stands for is the responsibility of the scientific community to robustly promote and defend both scientific freedom and scientific responsibility for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm sure you have some questions for her, and I'd ask you to hold them for our Q&A period. Our next speaker is Kaveh Madani. He is an environmental scientist and activist, Iran's former deputy vice president, as the former deputy head of the country's Department of Environment, the former vice president of the UN Environment Assembly Bureau, and a visiting professor at the Center for Environmental Policy of Imperial College London. His core experience and research interests include integrated water, environmental, and energy management. He has worked extensively on water, environmental, climate change, and energy problems in various parts of the world. He has more than 200 publications and has received numerous awards for his fundamental research contributions, teaching, as well as outreach and humanitarian activities, including the New Faces of Civil Engineering recognition in 2012, the Arne Richter Award for Outstanding Young Scientists in 2016, and the Walter Huber Civil Engineering Research Prize in 2017. Dr. Madani.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction and for the invitation. You know, you heard some stories about Iran, and I'm one of those people who earned a position in Iran for my scientific and outreach contributions, but then got penalized heavily for my scientific contribution. So it creates some sort of confusion for whether it's good to get into these activities or not. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story. I think everyone knows that it's not the best time to be Iranian. You get penalized and you get attacked by your own government, your own regime, and the rest of the world. It's hard for you to move freely. It's hard for you to travel to anywhere. Now you're on their Muslim ban, which doesn't let you get into the United States. And you're under screening all the time. Once you get out of Iran, you're under surveillance by both your own country and other places you go to. And this puts a lot of Iranians in a very weird position. Like many others, I left the country when I was 22, did my undergraduate in Iran, then went to Sweden, started my master's there, ended up in California doing my PhD and postdoc, got my first faculty position in Florida, and then went to London and Imperial College London, and over there I got more and more engaged with Iran because of distance. Before that, it was quite impossible to be active in Iran. Why? Because Iranian students get one entry visa. I mean, at least they used to get that. And you can never travel back. You cannot see your family easily. You're under pressure. You still have to work as an immigrant, be competitive, work hard like others, under pressure. And then you might not feel always equal. Anyway, like doing more and more work related to Iran's water and environment eventually got me the invitation of the current government of Iran to go and serve as the deputy head of Iran's Department of Environment. It was a moment to make a big decision. I mean, finally, someone from my generation, the generation was born after the Revolution of 1979, getting an invitation from the government. I don't belong to the inner circle. The only reason they're inviting me is because of my science, because of what I've said, and I've always been very critical of what has been happening in Iran, water policies and so on. And do you take that, do you say yes to that offer or not? My thought was that the chance of success is pretty low, but if I succeed, then there's more space for others. There's more space for people who have left the country and have their heart back at home, people who know what they're talking about to an extent, at least technically. And so that was the decision to make. And I said yes, with a lot of hope. But I got appointed on a Sunday. I was in London. I arrived in Tehran Wednesday morning. I got arrested up, right at the airport. I mean, that was my welcoming ceremony, I would say. Everything, all my accounts got hacked. Everything, so they violated my privacy, and then the battle started. As soon as I got appointed, hardliner media accusing me of working for CIA, MI6, Mossad, and all that, and criticizing what I've said scientifically. Well, science was a good backup. I could have always fought back in interrogation, saying that what I'm saying is based on science, based on peer-reviewed publications. I never changed my word. I was always I always tried to stick to the narratives which were based on my results. But hardliners don't understand this. Radicals don't understand this because they have a mission, they have an ideology, and it's a big battle. Now, what do you do as a scientist? I try to fight back. I try to raise my voice. I try to, stay there and help. Try to understand their concerns. Try to sit with them, talk to them, for hours. But it was getting worse and worse. You might have heard about the environmentalists in Iran. Eight environmentalists at a moment are in jail because the government is suspicious of their activities, which were about Iranian cheetahs. One is dead. And I myself eventually had to flee the country after being interrogated, arrested, and a lot of things. And it was a moment, lost for me. But let me tell you something. I mean, in those moments that I was under pressure, I was hoping, I mean, my degrees were getting questioned, my papers were getting questioned, my awards were getting questioned. So to them, it was like all, you know, done by MI6 and CIA and blah, blah, blah. I was hoping that some of my colleagues would speak up and say that this guy is a solid scientist. I was hoping that, you know, one of these agencies or organizations would have given me an award to stand up and say he got it because he, you know, he deserved it. But none of these happen. Why? Because we get confused, we get frustrated as scientists when we have to battle, you know, fight with politics. But this story is not unique to Iran. I mean, a few weeks ago they arrested another lady doing research on population because you know, both of us, I would say, we challenge the narrative of the government or the system, saying that, for example, we have to be food self-sufficient, or like, you know, we have to grow the population, blah, blah, blah. But this is not unique to Iran, and I think what is happening in Tehran right now can happen anywhere else in the world if we don't take action, if we don't speak up. We are, you know, I was very interested in working at the interface of science and policy. But when I sat at a very high-level position, I realized that I can convince the policymakers to an extent, technically, but as long as the society is not sold on the idea, I cannot move my agenda forward. We missed the fact. I discounted the power of society. And when I sat in that position, I tried to communicate with the people. It's never exciting or like, you know, we can now go to our department head and say, I mean, I gave a talk at the high school in the neighborhood, I did this and that, like, you know, which was not high level. It's not like, you know, related to the Congress or Parliament and blah, blah, blah. You don't get attention. But really, like, that's one thing we need to do. And as I said, it's not about Iran. Yesterday, you know, the president of Iran started questioning climate change. One of my accusations is actually trying to ratify the Paris Agreement to limit development in Iran. Who else says that? President Trump, right? You know, radicals are radicals, no matter if they're blonde or have a, like, you know, black hair. I mean, there should be some genetics studies, I think. But it's the same. Radicals want walls. They like enemies. This is how they get attention. This is how they survive. And science should, you know, politics always divide. I mean, and science should unite us. And I think we are not strongly engaging with the public. We're not talking to them. Now let's go to the other side of the ocean. What is happening to a lot of us? Sanctions has a huge impact on research in Iran, has a huge impact on flow of people freely from one country to another. A lot of students, Iranian students, are now frustrated. It has impact sometimes on publishers publishing papers. I mean, these are like, you know, these things are happening in academia. This is in the scientific world. People become more Catholic than the Pope. They try to interpret things and, you know, by the sanctions. We have had cases that universities in the United States saying that we're not going to review applications from Iranian students. Just a few months ago, this happened in Australia as well, because everyone is getting paranoid. I was under a lot of pressure when I was a faculty at the University of Central Florida, where the expert control officer was always walking to my office, and I was doing water and environmental research. It was not anything related to space or, like, you know, missiles or nuclear activities. And so I think, I do think that we have to speak up, and believe me, right, that when you challenge the narrative sold by the radicals with facts and figures, people are smart enough to buy them. People are smart enough to get them, and that's a big threat. So I had the chance to kind of escape the country, but it came back to academia with the big, strong belief in the fact that we, knowledge is our weapon, and that we discount the power of knowledge. We talk too sophisticatedly. We don't like, talking to the lay folks. We always want big, high-profile stuff and so on. And this is exactly what we need, improving our skills, our communication skills, talking to those who should know, talking to them in a simple language. of course, the academic system also should revise a lot of its, like, you know, its incentive structure to promote these things. But I think we are very interested in publishing high-impact journal papers, but we have our time. We're not that much interested in doing an interview, or like we get frustrated by the journalists who manipulate our statements, and we always, once we do an interview, we get nervous because people attack us, people, you know, give us nasty comments, whereas when we come here in our own circles, we give each other awards and everyone is happy, and we feel important and proud. So this is my message, or what I learned. You know, first is never be afraid of speaking up. Yes, some of us get penalized, some of us get into trouble, but science would win eventually. And the other is if we don't speak up, the people who can, you know, who know how to communicate to the public win. And a good example of that is happening in the United States, where it has the best scientists, best universities in the world, some of the top researchers, and climate change is being questioned by the United States president in the 21st century. And so don't get surprised if people in the developing world don't want to ratify the Paris Agreement and are afraid of joining these things because the President of the United States is doing that. How many statements have we issued? How many times are we talking about this? Right now, I mean, there's even an overlap between AGU and COP24, which is not very, I think, constructive. But how many times have we bothered doing this? How many times have we bothered posting things online, simple graphs, explaining them, recording a simple video, and so on? And the other thing, honestly, we have to have I don't know if we can have an association or union, this and that, and unfortunately, some of these unions get politicized a lot of times. I know people who get funded by some of these organizations have claimed to be strong scientists, and there's no evidence of scientific research. I know that people misuse scientific environments for espionage and so on. I know that a lot, you know, some of the good universities invest in training spies. These are like evidence that people have, and then all of us get exposed. And now if we don't defend ourselves, if we don't defend our science, our beliefs, our research, then we have a hard time. If we become more Catholic than the Pope and think whatever we are doing is violation of this law and that rule, then it's hard. According to the export control officer, you know, so back in the day, I was not even allowed to take my watch or like my cell phone to Iran because it's violating the export control policies, and it's a tech transfer, right? If you want to stand by their rules and stupid things, you cannot even move around, you cannot speak, you cannot, you know, say what you believe in, and you cannot educate people. And I think scientists are smart enough to keep up the, you know, science diplomacy and exchanges, and those are very healthy. U.S.-Iran exchanges it's a very, very good example of, you know, people talking. Russians and Americans during the Cold War, they continue to talk and communicate and educate each other. And I think we should not be frustrated by these walls that the radicals want. And there is a lot to be done. And let's monitor who's missing. Last year I was missing at AGU. So who's missing and what we can do for them, and don't be afraid of speaking up. And once you do those things, even if they're in prison and they're in their cell and they're not hearing you, their families would, and other people would. You know, these systems create the benefit of doubt. Like people start thinking, you know, something might have done wrong by this person and that person. Once people come behind them, it's really hard to sell those nasty ideas and conspiracy theories to the public. We should defend and we should speak up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Keva, for those inspiring remarks. Our next speaker is Lauren Morello. Lauren is Nature's U.S. News editor. She studied chemistry at Drew University and earned a master's degree in science journalism at Boston University. Lauren was previously a reporter covering climate change science and policy at Climate Wire. She has also written extensively about oceanography, ecology, nanotechnology, and biotechnology, and she spent several years as a beat reporter covering the U.S. Congress. Lauren, please.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to AGU for inviting me to speak today. So I've been asked to give you a journalist perspective on how the resurgence of nationalism is affecting science. I'm going to focus mainly on Europe, which for now still includes the UK, but more on that in a minute. Before I go farther, I should say that my remarks are informed by the work of 24 other journalists at Nature. If you're not familiar with Nature's news team, we're editorially independent from our parent journal, and we cover science and science policy around the world. I run the team that covers North and South America, but our headquarters newsroom is in London, and we have journalists working out of France, Germany, China, and Australia as well. We've certainly seen rising nationalism in the United States during Donald Trump's presidency, with the many travel bans as one really obvious example. But today I'm going to focus on Brexit, which has been one of the biggest politics stories that Nature has reported on over the last 3 years or so, beginning with the run-up to the referendum in June 2016. I think the first shock for scientists was that Britain voted to leave the EU. The polls were tight right to the end, and the Leave faction ended up winning 52% to 48%. Polls suggest that scientists wanted to stay in the EU by a wider margin than the general public did, ultimately. As one infectious disease researcher at Imperial College London told us right after the vote, I was on a career panel only yesterday singing the praises of the UK as a wonderful place of opportunity for young scientists, and I feel like that has changed overnight. There's a lot of uncertainty about what Brexit will mean for science, but it's pretty clear that the current freedom of movement for EU citizens coming to the UK will end. Right now, EU citizens from outside Britain have been able to live and work there without special permission, and vice versa for Brits in mainland Europe. A lot of people think that Britain will now end up with a points-based system for European immigrants that would favor highly skilled workers. And in theory, that could benefit science. But many of the UK's big science groups are worried that a point system would work well for established researchers, but make immigration harder for PhD students, and postdocs and lab technicians. And British labs depend on European immigrants to fill all sorts of jobs. According to the UK Royal Society, about 15% of the academic staff at British universities come from other EU countries. In 2015, that meant there were about 32,000 academic staff in the UK from other EU countries. The figures are pretty similar to if you look at PhD students in Britain. 14% come from other EU countries. So there are potentially thousands of people each year, tens of thousands of people who would need to join into a new immigration system after Britain leaves the EU. But the country doesn't actually have the capacity to start processing visas for that many extra people, according to an analysis by some of my colleagues at Nature. And they base their findings on immigration data they obtained from the UK government under freedom of information laws. One thing that makes this so difficult is because EU citizens can freely move in and out of the UK right now, there are no figures on how many come in each year to work in UK science. But our analysis shows that requiring EU scientists to obtain visas would basically double the number of academics who go through Britain's immigration system each year, and the system is already stressed. In 2017, the UK approved visas for about 20,000 researchers from outside the EU, but very few of them came in via the so-called Tier 1 Exceptional Talent Visa, which targets top scientists and engineers. Only about 1,000 academics got in that way. Most of the rest of those 20,000 researchers came in by another route for highly skilled workers, which is called a Tier 2 visa. But that kind of visa is expensive, and it's increasingly hard to get because the UK has lowered the number of these that it gives out every year. And many researchers from outside the EU struggle to get short-term visas to visit Britain for conferences and research collaboration. So the system is really stressed, and requiring EU researchers to obtain visas could overload it. That really conflicts with the culture of science, which is so global and interconnected. As one of my colleagues said to me last week, for many scientists, their brain is really their passport. A really good example of the global nature of science comes from the Francis Crick Institute in London, which is a big, new, fancy $880 million biomedical research facility, which was designed to be the largest in Europe and opened about 2 months after the Brexit vote in a case of spectacularly bad timing. One of the researchers we've talked to there, Jurne Ule, is from Slovenia, and the lab he runs includes members from Switzerland, Spain, France, and Italy, along with the UK. That kind of a mix isn't uncommon in countries like the UK that are global science powers, as I'm sure you all know. Ule says that Brexit talk just immediately brings down the mood in his lab, and that if the UK ends up going with a hard Brexit, which means leaving the EU without plans in place to govern things like trade and immigration, he'll consider leaving the Crick after a decade in the UK because he feels that a core value of his lab is openness. Similarly, one of my colleagues at Nature, Lizzie Gibney, a reporter, was telling me about a couple she's friends with who are neuroscientists working in London. One's British and one is American, and they're both pretty well established. And now they're thinking about leaving the UK for positions in either the United States or Germany because of Brexit. Even though the British government has said that any Europeans living in the UK when Brexit takes effect can stay, the uncertainty about immigration over the longer term already seems to be driving down the number of European scientists coming to the UK to work or study. And some people who have the right to stay in the UK after Brexit, no matter what, like Ule at the Crick and Lizzie's neuroscientist friends, are thinking about leaving. So from a journalist perspective, Brexit has basically just been a major PR disaster for UK science. British universities tell us that people from EU countries aren't applying to work or study in the UK at the same rate as they did before the vote, and a lot of researchers from outside the UK have told us they don't feel welcome in Britain anymore. The UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, has said that if you're a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere, and people seem to be taking that to heart. But it's just not Brexit's impact on immigration that scientists are worried about. Money is the other widespread concern. The EU supplies about 16% of Britain's research budget right now, and it's just not clear whether or how the UK government would make up for the loss of all those euros. There's talk about the UK participating in the next big EU funding program, which is called Horizon Europe, and it starts in 2021, and it's supposed to give out about 100 billion euros over 8 years. But that would require the UK to pay in a lot of money, potentially billions of pounds, and it's not clear the government wants to do that. Even if they do, the details can't be sorted out until a Brexit deal is in place. So even in a best case scenario, there could be a year or two gap where EU funding disappears in the UK and nothing replaces it. In the meantime, some scientists in the UK have told us that they already feel like second-class citizens and members of EU-funded collaborations. One astrophysicist at the University of Manchester named Anna Scaife said last year that her European colleagues have been wary about starting new projects with her because of uncertainty over what happens after Brexit takes effect in March. And Scaife herself is hesitant to apply for new EU funding because she worries that she'll be a liability for her European collaborators. She told us that that would be the worst thing, to see a project lose and to worry that she might be responsible. So what happens now? First off, I should say that scientists and everyone else in the UK have bigger and more existential worries than research funding and even immigration. We're at the point where news outlets are reporting that the UK government is making plans to stockpile food and medicine to ensure adequate supplies in the first weeks after a hard Brexit, if it comes to that. So it's just a mess. As one of my colleagues in London said last week when I was talking to him as I prepped this talk, by the time you do the panel, everything will have changed again. And that's part of the problem for science. Only when the UK and EU agree on a Brexit plan can negotiations start over things like science funding or trade deals that could create smoother immigration pathways to the UK for researchers from individual European countries. UK universities and science groups have been pushing the government to protect science, but honestly, it just appears pretty low on the government's priority list. And the government keeps churning through science ministers. Chris Skidmore, who was appointed on December 5th, is the 5th science minister in 8 years. The previous 2 quit over Brexit-related concerns. Some UK universities are trying to cope with the uncertainty by establishing alliances with schools in mainland Europe, so they'll have a legal presence on the continent that might let them keep drawing European Union science funding even after a hard Brexit. Oxford has a deal with 4 institutions in Berlin. Cambridge has a new partnership with Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. King's College is working with Technical University of Dresden, and there are many more of these arrangements that I'm just going to omit for time. On an individual level, We've talked to plenty of EU scientists in the UK who are applying for British citizenship, and British scientists in mainland Europe who are seeking citizenship in the countries where they're living. But there are other important concerns about Brexit that just may be impossible to address. The UK has played a leading role in shaping European Union policy on key science issues, such as stem cell research, genetically modified foods, and climate change. And that's going to end on March 29th, 2019, if not sooner. The United Kingdom is certainly not the only country where nationalism is resurgent, and science is struggling to cope with that political shift. The US has its travel bans and its border wall. Hungary just forced the Central European University out of the country, and you've heard about Kave's experiences in Iran. But what is happening in the UK shows clearly how hard it can be to square the strong international focus of modern science with policies in countries that are turning inward. Before I end my talk, I just wanted to insert a plug. Nature's journalists are covering all these issues, and we're very interested in hearing from anybody about any difficulties you're running into because of issues like Brexit. The best way to reach us is an email. We have an About the Editors page. You can find my email address and those of other editors at the journal, and we would just love to hear from you because we think these issues are important, and we depend on talking to scientists to understand what's really happening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lauren, for that very clear and thorough description of the impacts of nationalism in one particular country. Our next speaker is Dr. Carlos Nobre, a distinguished researcher of University of Sao Paulo's Institute for Advanced Studies. He is also a professor at Brazil's National Institute of Space Research's doctoral programs in Earth System Science. He served as a member of the International Scientific Advisory Panel of Climate Change Adaptation Program, the Netherlands, and a member of UN Secretary General's High-Level Scientific Advisory Panel on Global Sustainability. His research interests are Earth system science and environmental sciences with a focus on atmospheric sciences, climate, meteorology, Amazon and climate modeling, biosphere-atmosphere interaction, climate change, and natural disasters. He is one of the authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fourth Assessment Report, which in 2007 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He is a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, the World Academy of Sciences, and a foreign member of the US National Academy of Sciences. He was recently elected International Secretary of AGU and will assume that post and become a member of the AGU Board of Directors as of January 2019. But we wanted to jump the gun a little bit and get him engaged, and he allowed us to twist his arm to serve on this panel. So, Carlos, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. After listening to my previous colleagues here on this panel, I think, coming from Brazil, I feel very happy because, compared to Iran, Turkey, etc., many countries, our life in Brazil, throughout my scientific career was relaxed, free exchange of ideas, international collaboration. However, things are changing. Unfortunately, things are changing. Thinking about this recent and somewhat unexpected rise of nationalism in many democracies, let me start by quoting Levitsky and Ziblatt in the book How Democracies Die. They state quite correctly my view. The tragic paradox of the electoral route to authoritarianism is that democracy's assassins use the very institutions of democracy to gradually, sadly, and even legally kill it. We have seen that happening in some countries for 40 years, in many other countries unexpectedly in the last 5, 10 years. Perhaps it comes as a surprise to most of us. The rise in nationalism and the accompanying authoritarian values and populist rhetoric in the last few years. Quite disconnected from the more traditional political battles between left and right. And coming about after over 50 years of continuous rise of social liberalism. That's what we always thought, the world was becoming more liberal. That is unfortunately changing. In my own assessment, the rise of nationalism, populism, authoritarianism has some roots on the overall perception of people, of the failure of representative democracy to effectively serve the people. In part, this is caused by corrupted political systems and the lack of actual commitment to voters' needs and aspirations by elected representatives. In this belief, people turn to strong leaders with the populist authoritarian discourse. I'm the people, I can speak for the people, I can defend the people. They look for a father figure who will ensure the well-being of all. That's somehow also extend to the roots of the current trend of anti-intellectualism that's increasing dangerously in many countries. We've seen here examples from Iran and other, Turkey, which is going on for a longer time in Iran, for sure. This concept wants to instill dogma to science, that is my truth against your truth. By principle of practice, of course, for all of us, for our life, our philosophy, almost our religion, science is all but dogmatic. But perhaps we are not communicating that widely and at the digital speed of social media. We are lagging behind in communicating that we are not dogmatic. On the positive side, I want to tell you a story, a personal story, that taught me one value in the fight against irrational nationalism in my country. That's the value of persistence in pursuing the advancement of science. This story has to do with my country and the Amazon. In the early 1990s, a group of international scientists launched the idea of an ambitious scientific experiment in the Amazon to understand its importance as a regional entity for the Earth system and what climate change, deforestation, fire would do to put that system at risk. It became the well-known LBA experiment, and many participants of this AGU fall meeting took part in it, including our president, Eric Davidson. It took 5 long and dragging years from 1993 to 1998 to obtain approval of this from Brazilian government. I was deeply involved in this process, difficult negotiations. LBA is an international scientific experiment. The difficulties arose from nationalist military commanders afraid of opening up the Amazon natural resource to, quote unquote, foreign interests, as they perceive it at the time. For instance, NASA research aircraft flying over the Amazon forest was seen as a risk to Brazil's sovereignty. Fortunately, after 5 years, we succeeded, and we got government approval. LBA quickly grew to become the largest international scientific enterprise on tropical forests ever realized. It would be impossible to carry out such an experiment by any Amazonian country alone. We had all Amazonian countries participating, US, strong participation by US scientific community, including AGU associations, 7 European countries and Japan. We had over 1,200 actually scientists and students participating. LBA is running even today, 20 years later. The legacy of LBA to the scientific empowerment, and we are talking about democracies and we talk about empowerment, of Amazonian countries is remarkable. Over 500 PhDs from those countries and most of them remain as scientists in the Amazon. So they're helping to develop knowledge, important knowledge for sustainable development. Today, we understand much better the key importance of Amazonian ecosystems to mitigate climate change as a potent natural carbon sink, maintain climate and hydrological stability, and protect biodiversity. That is, the Amazon is proven to be a key regional entity of the Earth system, and that was due mostly to these 20 years of integrated international research. That knowledge has been disseminated widely through the societies of Amazonian countries and also internationally. Public opinion polls show consistently in Brazil that over 90% of Brazilians are against Amazon deforestation, consistently. So if you believe we live in a democracy, the Amazon should be really protected. Positively and surprisingly, this is the surprise after this long period, surprise to me and surprise to many, the Brazilian military today are adamantly against further deforestation in the Amazon. Science taught them that the greatest value of the Amazon lies in its living ecosystems, not in replacing the forest, not in mining. Ironically, there is some very small hope today because of this new government, that these military that really were converted to understand the role of a big tropical system, this military will be able to slow down the aggressive drive towards deforestation by the newly elected nationalistic, populist, authoritarian president of Brazil. And if you read the news every day, things are getting worse and worse and worse. Finally, let me say that an organized, strong, and united international scientific community, we representing that community, we must fight back the threats that current trends of nationalism and isolationism present to international collaboration. Science, as my colleagues also already mentioned very vividly, science does not erect walls. Science builds bridges, as has been doing for centuries. We should use science really to reduce difference between countries, between cultures, between people. We must persist and forge a common response and a common front of scientists from all countries to maximize international collaboration, even on the face of expected difficulties for some. International associations like AGU have a greater responsibility to increase efforts to ensure what international science collaboration will continue to grow and deliver improved well-being for humanity and a sustainable future for the planet. We must persist. That's our moral responsibility. Thank you.
So I have a couple of points that I'd like the panel to discuss before we open it up for Q&A from the audience. I've noted in these presentations some very hopeful signs and some very not so hopeful signs. Carlos just told us of how impactful an international project was and how it actually brought around the Brazilian military from initially being skeptical of that project to now being one of the advocates for environmental protection and perhaps to some extent a check on the future of activities of the new government once it takes power. That I think is a very hopeful sign. We also heard Kava tell us how important it is for scientific societies, colleagues to speak out, and how much impact it makes on families and in some cases on the governments. And I think that's also a very positive sign. Of course, we've also heard of the the mess that is, I think mess would be an appropriate word, of the situation in the UK, uncertainties regarding Brexit, and then, of course, the horrific stories that individual scientists are facing. So my question to the panel is, how do you feel that this notion of scientists being able to engage a broader range of the civil society, perhaps the military, perhaps the conservative wings of governments, but to build coalitions for science so that when nationalist leaders do get elected through democratic means, but then start to try to degrade that democratic process, as Carlos said, that there are some checks because there's a broader constituency across political and social realms to support that science. Is that too Pollyannish or naive of me to think that that is a reasonable way for scientific societies to work to not only promote our science, but to promote it to broad segments of our society? Go ahead. Anyone would like to take it?
I'll start. I don't think it's too Pollyanna-ish. I think nationalism is about what's considered strategic isolationism, and it's in the national interest to support a strong scientific infrastructure and enterprise. And so being able to articulate that clearly to those whose interests are at play is what is needed to be done. I also agree with the comment about general science communication to the public, because ultimately it's the public who can or will not accept a certain government and its policies. Though I caution against encouraging all scientists to be pushed to communicate their science, because I don't think all scientists are good at it. I think a lot of scientists are or could be trained, but not all scientists should be required. So I think it's possible. I think it is in the national interest to support a strong scientific enterprise, which these days must include international cooperation and collaboration. But that needs to be expressed clearly, and recognizing the interests that are underlying the nationalist fever.
So I think, so how do you define nationalism? Nationalism, I think, is a dynamic concept, and the way people understand and defining depends on the priorities they have and the priorities they understand. So I think populist politicians are right. I mean, most politicians think about staying in power and getting reelected, and they respond to the priorities of the society. What are the typical priorities of society? Jobs, economy, housing, and all these things. Many other things that we deal with are secondary things to both the society and the politicians. What we need to do and can do is to change this, to change the priority, to change the weights of the concepts that matter to us and topics and so on. So at the end of the day, policymakers remain responsive to what people want to a good extent, even in dictatorships. So I think it is actually it's not naive, and it's actually very smart. It should be promoted, and it should be a skill that we develop. I agree that not all scientists should be doing interdisciplinary work, not all scientists should be talking to media, not all scientists should be talking to the public. But if we as scientists have to learn how to teach, we can also learn how to talk to the public, and this should be done. And we have to think about our impact, how are we making impacts? How do we measure and understand and evaluate our impacts? And all these things that we have generated, all these data sets, all this information, where did they go? And I insist on the fact that now we're talking, I mean, I talked about the negative stuff, but there are tons of positive stuff. Even, to begin with, just getting me into the position was because of talking to policymakers and public. So a lot of times you can change the narrative of the society, you can change the opinion of the policymakers, and these are good signs. And I think you can do it everywhere, but of course when we echo each other, we're much stronger. But if it's only a few of us who go out there and there's no backup or like no support, then we get shot easily.
This doesn't seem to be turning on.
Yeah.
We turn on as well.
Thank you.
There's also a handheld mic if you'd like.
Okay. I mean, I think the top-down approach is a reasonable one. I just advise that people temper their expectations because I think in a lot of places where nationalism is resurgent, you've seen kind of a hostility towards expertise. In the UK, Michael Gove, who's currently the DEFRA minister, he's in charge of food, environment, and rural affairs, and was a big Brexit backer, famously said in a discussion leading up to Brexit that the people have had enough of experts. And you can kind of see that in the revolving door science ministers over in the UK. The government says, oh yes, science is important, and they're just ignoring all of that right now. And I think similarly in the United States, it's clear that the Trump administration has a very different conception of the role of science in policymaking than some administrations in the past. And this is why I'd say I just think it's also important to go bottom up, and there are lots of different ways for individual scientists to take actions that they might be comfortable with. I think we saw, for example, with the first travel ban in the US, a lot of scientists speaking out on Twitter, and the impact on science became a part of the narrative about the travel ban, even in general interest publications, the New York Times, not just Nature and Science. And we saw, for example, people speaking up on behalf of their colleagues, people who were in a better position, who weren't themselves affected by the ban, but they worked with people who were, and I think it's important to think about, in a country like the US or in the UK where it is safe to speak out and tell stories humanizing the impact of policies can be a really effective way of making the public aware of your issue. And I realize that sounds really self-serving coming from a journalist, but it's true. And you can do this in other ways by being active in your communities and being, someone who's out there as a scientist. It doesn't have to be a media interview, or if you don't really, and it doesn't have to be speaking on controversial stuff. Part of it, I think, is just being present and taking all opportunities. I think in the end, you're going to need both. You're going to need action and letters by groups of scientific societies and Nobel laureates and people like that. But you're also going to need to be on the ground thinking about how you feel comfortable highlighting how these issues are affecting you kind of every day at a single person level.
Just to complement, I think, I still think, some of us or most of us, we have really responsibilities to communicate better science. And also in this digital era and with social media, we are actually losing the battle. And I mentioned that before, that unfortunately we are being shown as, almost a religion, our truth against some other truth of the big leader of a particular religion. So it was not like that until recently. So I think we have to find new ways of communicating science. We really, to show that science is not dogmatic, we do not have absolute truth, we have relative or improving our description of how things function in nature. I mentioned that in particular with respect to climate change. Many of us are climate scientists, and we are so concerned about climate change because you know, we are really moving the planet to disaster. And there is no way to even to consider the issue controversial, because there is much more certainty about human nature of climate change than any, let's say you go to a medical doctor and the medical doctor will issue diagnostics, there's much more certainty, much more, and there are many studies showing that. So I think we have really to be, I would call, responsible advocates. We have to be responsible advocates, not the party, politicians, but responsible advocates from what the science is telling us, the urgency of some of these issues, and there is no way out of that responsibility.
Thank you. I just want to ask one more question before we open it up for the audience. Jessica, you referred to many of the activities that AAAS is leading, and we've heard from the other panelists the need for scientists to work together. Carlos just mentioned how we need to show that science is not dogmatic, and we also have learned that by speaking together we may have more impact on human rights issues, on particularly issues for individual scientists. What do we need? Are the structures already in place internationally, from cooperation among scientific societies? Do we need something new to get broader input from more scientific societies across the world to work together on these topics? I believe it's on.
It is. I would guard against creating additional institutions. I think what we need to do is simply coordinate better amongst those that exist. I think, certainly I've been at AAAS for 11 years working in this area, and I've seen a significant increase in the awareness amongst scientific societies about the role that they can play, and an interest in coordinating more, both domestically and internationally. But there are so many more organizations that could be involved. So I think potentially developing a structure that brings in existing institutions could make sense internationally, but I wouldn't suggest another organization is necessary.
And what is the existing framework that seems most useful? I mean, is it, what's the new ICSU? ICS, yeah.
ICS.
Yes, ICS, or is it what AAAS is doing? You know,
so it's interesting you should say that. So as we've both mentioned, AAAS manages this network, which is in practice all domestic US scientific societies. We have currently 26 member organizations. And we've thought about that question, about does it make sense to try and internationalize the coalition. I would actually suggest that maybe coalitions of this sort based regionally would be more effective. Coordination would be easier. Sometimes the issues raised have a regional tinge to them. And then when you have regional structures, across those regional structures, they could coordinate. But I'm not sure that an international body is necessarily what is needed. The former ICSU does actually have a committee on scientific freedom and responsibility, but it hasn't served a function in reaching out broadly. They work with national academies to some extent internationally, but not with a lot of the professional societies.
Would anyone else care to comment? Okay, thank you. So I'd be happy to open questions to the audience. So there's a microphone here if you'd like to come up and introduce yourself briefly and pose your question.
Hi, my name is Katerina. I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Arizona. I actually just finished my master's, and I'm very interested in doing a PhD. I think what you're talking about is really interesting, especially because in the US, we don't often think about these problems, and it's something that's very new to all of us. And so I think the perspectives from such a large panel is really important. My question really is that, are there any resources for someone who's a young scientist interested in helping and interested in the topic? And I get very excited when I hear about this, but I'm really unsure of where to start gathering resources so I can learn and actually effectively communicate to the public what I'm doing and what it is that we're publishing. And that the scientific community is now sort of on agreeance on climate change. But if you talk to me individually and you ask me my opinion, it's very hard for me to communicate this to an individual person. So yeah, do you have any resources of where to begin? And when you feel, exactly how do you know if you're the right person to be going out there to speak, or if you just stick to publishing papers instead?
On a practical note, the first thing I'd say is that you should check and see if your university does any kind of media training for students, postdocs, professors. Often they do, and I think that's kind of a first step. You know, they'll kind of teach you how to deal with people like me and answer the questions how you like, and just give you tips on kind of breaking down and avoiding jargon. And that's one really concrete thing that I bet the University of Arizona has available.
I wouldn't be doing my job as president of AGU if I didn't speak up at this point and talk about our Sharing Science program, which has many different components, from webinars and toolkits that are online to a project we have called Voices for Science that you can apply to get some of this training. And so there are multiple ways of doing that, and there's some people in the room actually who could help you with that afterwards. So that's something we're trying to work hard on. Thank you for your question. Anyone else?
My name is Antonio Meira. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Arizona. So from what I understand from the discussion is that communication has to be put as one of the priorities as in the formation of any new scientist. If you want to fight back this rise of discrediting of science at the pace that things are happening. And my question for the panel is, wouldn't it be time for scientist associations and universities to start changing the structure of rewarding in academia in order to propel people to really make that a priority? Because coming from a student and early career perspective, we are pressed to still follow the status quo of publishing and getting those publications, which we understand is of prime importance. But after watching this panel, I feel like if we don't do something in maybe 5 to 10 years, if we don't quickly change this paradigm on the importance of communicating science as almost an obligation, we won't be able to catch up with the rise of these nationalist regimes.
Just a quick comment. I couldn't agree with you more, and this has been a recurring theme in conversations and comments that I've heard over the years, particularly from young scientists who are really interested in bringing their science to the public. I agree that reward structures do need to change. I think that's going to take a long time. There are many reasons to do it. The one you're saying is an important one. In the meantime, there are some chinks being made in that system, and I'm thinking of work done by something called the National Center for Science and Civic Engagement. They work with professors in teams across campuses in the United States to help them teach what needs to be taught. So take Physics 101. Starting with the question, what is it that a student needs to understand about physics in Physics 101? And then how can you teach them that through a civics lens? What are issues arising in their communities, in their states, in their country that would help them understand and apply that knowledge as effectively as perhaps it's being taught now? And that is a growing trend. I don't want to overstate how greatly it's growing, but it does exist. And I think that is going to be one way to still stay within the somewhat, might I say, antiquated structures of academia, while still learning and doing your science in a way that has relevance and engages your community.
Carlos?
I fully agree on the need, and also, but we are starting to learn, particularly from social science, that social scientists are starting to also to make metrics of rewarding the work, not only on our usually standard citation index and things like that. A lot of the repercussion of good social science that has to be published in peer review literature, but the repercussion is not on the citation index, is on social media and many other media. So now a lot of systems are starting to reward the impact of social scientists using some other metrics. This is something, for instance, happening in the UK. So I think, we have to think more and more because, communicating science, our prefer, and there is no way out, is the peer review literature. However, that could be, we have to think harder how make that knowledge to really to percolate society in many different ways. So I think, even natural scientists, we should also think about ways to rewarding other metrics to see how effective we communicate our science and how that science improves society, improves human well-being.
So as a journalist, I don't know that I have great advice on how to move scientists away from impact factors and things like that, but I can give you a really good example of kind of subverting the system and kind of achieving what you're talking about within the confines of what's acceptable. A scientist I know, a glaciologist named Matt Siegfried, he's at Colorado School of Mines now, but he did his PhD at Scripps Oceanography, and he ran a Twitter account for their glaciology program and really developed his outreach skills that way, and I think the folks at Scripps loved it. That's actually how I ran across him. He tweeted out something interesting and I made contact, and one thing led to another. He eventually did like a blog for me from a research trip to Antarctica, and the folks at Scripps loved it so much they changed the way they did all their messaging in their aquarium, the Birch Aquarium, which is pretty well known. When they redid the exhibits and the president of Scripps, said, Matt, this is because what I saw on your blog. So I mean, that's a little bit of a 1 in a million, but it shows you that you can take something like a department Twitter account that is socially acceptable, even where impact factors rule, I think, and turn it into a tool for communicating to the public, because that Twitter account wasn't aimed at other scientists necessarily. It was really aimed at the public, and I realize it's extra work, but I think for him in a lot of ways, it really did pay off, and he felt like, it accomplished something.
I think we should not wait for the systems to change. Pursue your dreams, do what you think is right. We had the same thing with interdisciplinary science when it, I think some years ago, I had this problem, for example, as I was talking too much about humans, and I was not considered by my fellow civil engineers as being a good engineer. They thought I was not good in math. Later on, some of the work I did, no one was willing to put his name on the papers that I wrote early on. Were game changers, and so there are systems are slow. Now interdisciplinary science. Look at how people get funded through NSF program. Here at AGU, when I was chairing the Water and Society Committee, when we started in the early days, we were not even getting a one oral session. Later on, we became so popular that they put a cap on the number of oral sessions that we were getting. To a lot of hydrologists, we were not good scientists, because again, talking about some things which were not fundamental in their opinion. So I think once you do good things, people get frustrated, people not like you, but then eventually that changes. We are a generation that are comfortable, we're comfortable with social media, we can do a lot of things, and we keep, we create the reward system ourselves, and over time the things that you do and people think are not significant become significant. So I think just do what you like.
Thank you.
I would add that AGU makes these sorts of changes because our membership demands it. And it's primarily our early career membership that's demanding it the most. So your voices are being heard and things are happening, and there is a gradual cultural change. We had a session Monday morning which had a fantastic panel, just like this panel, and we had good interaction with an audience, just like we are now, although the audience was disappointingly few in number, just like you are. So this is going to take time to have this happen, have the cultural change. But the point of that session was moving the needle on promotion and tenure, just exactly what you brought up. And there are universities that are starting to take that very seriously, and we were trying to learn from those experiences of what works and doesn't work. But I totally agree that we can't, that's an important thing to be moving ahead with, but in the meantime, you just have to have the courage to get up and do what needs to be done, as they say. And you will find a department or someone who will support you, and I'm convinced that if that's your dream, you'll make it work out somewhere, because there's enough people on that bandwagon now that you'll find a place to make it work. Did you have a question, sir?
Hi, I'm Tyrannism. I'm a geophysicist at Oxford, but more importantly, I guess I'm a German in the UK, and have lived in many countries, so I feel very compassionate about all these topics. And I guess my main sense of the rise of nationalism is kind of twofold. One is emotional, and I think it's the rise of fear, or politics and fear, and the other one is the lack of exposure for many people. So in Germany, for example, the right-wing votes mostly come in regions where there's least immigration. So I guess I wanted to bring up an anecdote that I had 2 weeks in a conference, TED conference, that I attended, and one of the attendants basically questioned to me the landing of the Apollo mission on Moon. And so we had a personal debate about this. And the very same person came to me after my talk, which was a scientific talk, which I tried to fill with sort of personal stories and compassion, and was very blown away by the talk. She really enjoyed the talk. So I guess my point is that there's a real point in making personal contact and getting across the compassion that we all have for science. And I think that really gets lost in the public often, where we have this rigorous procedure of publishing papers and everything has to be very serious. So I think the public really takes it to heart when you become extremely personal, and when you add this sort of flavor that we do this with a passion and with a heart. Especially when it comes to things like climate change, I think a lot of people take that as if we're taking something away from people, whereas what we're actually doing is being concerned about them and their children. So I think one of the problems is that we go through media. Actually, sorry if that affects someone, but I think the problem now is that people sort of retort back to their own corners within that filter through media. So it's much more useful to be in personal contact. So long story short, I think organizations like the AGU, which are so wide and global, would have a great impact if I think there was any sort of procedure that every AGU member could be motivated to directly interact. I think really personal interaction with people. Difficult to say what sort of procedures that could be, but I think that's definitely the most effective way of doing these things.
Just one quick reflection that makes me think about the important difference between science communication and public engagement. And I think what you're talking about there really is about engaging with somebody. And there certainly have been studies in the United States, first of all, that demonstrate that views on climate change align very clearly with political affiliations. But when local communities that may be more of the right are working hand in hand with scientists to address very local environmental issues that are impacted by climate, but they're local, and the public in that community is engaged, through that process, they learn to understand the science, they learn to understand what climate change really is about and how it impacts them personally. And that ultimately affects their understanding and beliefs of climate change. It's that engagement, not just the being communicated to, that I think is important.
Yes, I fully agree with you. But in fact, I mean, AGU has a program. It's called the Thriving Earth Exchange, which really goes exactly along those lines and exactly what you said, engaging scientists with communities in problem solving. So it's exactly what you said. It's growing, still not gigantic, but that's the idea.
I would just add, I think Jessica was referring to some of the work by Dan Kahan and others on climate change in Florida. And one of the important, I think, lessons to take away from that is they also kind of, when they reframed the issue as a local one, they kind of avoided using the words climate change, and they talked about sea level rise, because sea level rise is the thing that is going to crumble their roads and flood houses and things like that. So, I mean, I think an important thing for people to take away too when you're trying to engage is to think about how to frame something so that you might get around somebody's entrenched belief.
Right, the agronomists talk to their farmers about climate variability instead of climate change. Yes. Yes, one.
Hi, I'm Mark Moldwin from the University of Michigan. We're in our centennial, and thinking back to 1919, we were just post-World War I. And when you think about the rise of nationalism in terms of threat reduction and risk assessment, you think about the increased probability of conflict. Do you know what AGU's stance was in terms of war and peace during World War II? And if it should be the role of scientific societies to have clear statements that we're advocates for peace?
I confess I don't know the history of AGU well enough to respond to that. Joan, can you say anything?
Not seen that in the documentation pulled up for Centennial. I can put it on the list to look for.
That's a really interesting point, yeah. But, I mean, we could address the other part of your question, right? In terms of the more modern times, if anyone wishes to. So the AGU does have position statements on a number of topics, ranging from climate change, open data, ethics, and within that framework, I think it's certainly within our purview to talk about the importance of open and free exchange, which also means avoiding armed conflict, because that gets in the way of open and free exchange. And we can certainly make statements along those lines. I don't think you'd find AGU advocating specifically for, a position statement about Yemen in particular, for example, at the moment. And likewise, when we have position statements on climate change, we're talking about the urgency of recognizing the problem and finding solutions. We don't actually advocate that, well, we favor cap and trade versus carbon tax or anything like that. We don't take positions on specific remedies. But I think statements of principle is certainly something that we do, and I think many other scientific societies do as well. Would anyone else care to comment on that?
I think we should avoid making political statements. It's not healthy to get into politics. We can get shot, so I think what we can do is talking, and we should do is talking about facts and figures and impacts and things like that, rather than taking a position on a particular thing, right? So if it's sanctions, I would encourage people to talk about the effects, the unintended consequences of sanctions, or the things that should matter, and how they affect our communities and so on, rather than, you know, attacking sanctions in particular, because there are, like, you know, good reasons for those that, you know, the politicians believe in. When people talk about some, I would say, like, you know, environmentalists in danger, or this guy in prison, that, I always encourage people to talk about that person. Don't try to attack their narrative, like, you know, their particular narrative, but talk about this person's contribution, how it has made an impact, you know, what we're missing, and so on, rather than trying to attack the narrative, you know, directly attack the narrative that the politicians are selling. I think, you know, it's a dangerous space to get into.
Thank you. Sure, one more question.
Well, my name is Mario Mendiondo, professor at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. Thank you for your speeches. I enjoy very much. My question is, as a researcher, when I prepare and publish a paper in a high-impact journal, it's a kind of self-freedom, a self-happiness. But when I try to communicate with my children about my findings, it's very difficult. But if I invite them to go with me to the March for Science, for instance, or go with me in terms of the Earth Day, the Day of the Earth, they are naturally participating of this moment. So my message, perhaps my question is, how can we as researchers could create a more comfortable atmosphere to convince the early careers, the new generation of people, our children, to be part of a more freedom or science for freedom atmosphere? So my question is, or perhaps my message is, to commit or to promote more these kind of events going directly to schools. Because the children understand very well when we invite them to be part of a movement, to be part of a speech, speak loudly in favor of science. I think perhaps doing this well in this way, we can deliver a message for the next generation to become or to achieve a more, I say, a second generation of science or something like that, different that we are doing just now, because try to put more, say, a citizen or the humans in the loop to be, say, more public, more accessible for the younger, especially the younger, because if we are not achieving this topic, I think, well, we try to perhaps lose our message for the next decades. So that is perhaps my discussion about.
Right. Would anyone care to respond?
Thank you.
Just something quickly. AAAS has a program where we work with, I believe, but I could be wrong, primarily retired scientists, bringing them into classrooms. Not to suggest that their science teachers don't know what they're talking about, but to offer an opportunity for the students to hopefully be infected by the enthusiasm that scientist is able to convey about their career, what they achieved, what it was that they were working with, and so forth. And so that's one sort of direct link that is provided. And I'm sure there are ways of doing that don't require an organization to manage it, but you could offer to do that in your children's school, for example.
Anyone else? Okay, I think, oh, we have one more question. Go ahead.
That's the last question. I was wondering, we were talking mostly about academia. What about the scientists that are in government? And what can they do? How can they handle all these kind of issues that limit what they can say, what they can do?
Carlos, you were a scientist in government.
Well, yeah, as I said, I mean, in my career, you know, when I came back from the US, I did my PhD in here, finished in 1982, came back to Brazil. It was military dictatorship, but I mean, really, we could say whatever we wanted. It was the end of this military dictatorship. So I always worked in government until recently. We have never had, this is the case of Brazil. We have never had any limitations in our freedom working for government. We promoted climate change research. We are leading climate change research government institutions and along with universities. So it's a big mystery, even for me, what is happening in this country, US. Because also I interacted with government scientists throughout my career. And this is something that really is giving me preoccupation, even in a democracy, full-fledged democracy like this one, that eventually some government directions would preclude scientists even using the word climate change. This seems to be, you know, appalling to me. So that's not my personal experience, of course, in Brazil. Things may change with the new government, but I doubt. And however, I think, you know, government scientists, we are scientists. We are not government. I think before we are government employees, we are scientists, and we have to abide by our convictions, our belief in scientific truth, our belief that we have to communicate that truth. So I would really say government scientists will have to really put their positions as scientists before their alliance or their loyalty to the employer, the government. They are really, we are government, we work for the people. We do not work for a president or for a governor.
Okay. Well, actually, this is a good way to segue into an announcement, if you still have it in you, to go to another session shortly hereafter. Our plenary session that will begin in 25 minutes at the plenary ballroom in the convention center is with Dr. Jim Riley, who is the director of USGS. So here's a government scientist, a political appointee in the current administration, and as a government agency that was largely responsible for releasing the latest U.S. climate assessment. So it should be a very interesting session to hear what he has to say about that and the opportunity to ask him some questions. But for now, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel. It was, I thought, really interesting look from different perspectives that you couldn't have had by just having one person here. It was great to have all four of you, and thank you so much for your time and for your participation. Will you thank you.